Hey everyone, welcome to today's deep dive. I'm really pumped to have you here because we're going to be looking at this massive yet kind of totally under the radar shift happening in global trade right now. We hear all this talk about tariffs, trade wars, supply chain chaos, but there's actually a profound structural change quietly rewriting the rules of the global economy in the background. So let's just dive right in. We're talking about the carbon border tax and the totally new economic divide it's creating. And look, this isn't just academic theory. It's a fundamental rewiring of how nations buy and sell from each other. And it is literally happening right now as we speak. Okay, here's our quick roadmap for this breakdown. First, we'll look at this quiet global shift. Then we'll unpack the carbon tax itself. Section 3, we'll look at how the mechanism actually works. After that, we're going to examine the new economic divide, see how it's redrawing the trade map, and wrap up with exactly why this matters right now. All right, Section 1, a quiet global shift. The invisible force reshaping trade. It's kind of crazy, but history shows us that the biggest geopolitical shifts usually start super quietly in these boring policy documents, right? They don't launch with fireworks or grab front-page headlines immediately. Which brings us to a massive question. What exactly is quietly dividing the global economy right now? What is this invisible force that literally has governments and massive multinational corporations completely scrambling to adjust their decades-old supply chains? The answer? A carbon border tax. Now, look, I know that phrase sounds a bit dry, maybe a little highly technical, but make no mistake about it, this is absolutely not some small, irrelevant fee. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar rewrite of global commerce. It introduces a completely new variable into the math of international trade. So the absolute crucial point here is that this one single policy tool has the power to basically dictate who trades with whom and at what cost for decades to come. Moving right along. Section 2, unpacking the carbon tax, moving beyond the jargon. So if we're really going to understand this divide, we need to strip away all that complex policy language and just look at what this means on the ground. Now, you'll often hear this referred to by its acronym, CBAM, that stands for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It's a policy that places a price on the carbon emitted during the production of goods entering a customs territory. Actually, let's step back and just break that down, right? Traditionally, if you're manufacturing a steel beam, you pay for the iron ore, you pay for the labor and the shipping. Simple enough. But with CBAM, you are now also paying for the invisible exhaust, the carbon emissions generated while making that steel beam whenever you try to sell it across certain international borders. It's basically an adjustment mechanism to make absolutely sure that imported goods carry the exact same carbon costs as domestic goods. And honestly, the best way to visualize this is to think of it as a global trade toll booth. Imagine you're driving a heavily polluting car down the highway, right? And you hit a toll booth that charges you based on the exact color of your exhaust smoke. That is essentially what countries are setting up at their borders for imported goods. If your product was manufactured using highly carbon-intensive methods, well, that toll is going to be steep. If it was made using clean energy, the toll is low or maybe even non-existent. Boom! It instantly transforms carbon from this abstract environmental metric into a hard, inescapable financial cost right at the border. Okay, Section 3, how the mechanism works, from production to the border. Let's just trace this journey step by step to see how it plays out. Step 1 is production. Say a factory in one country fires up its furnaces to make materials like cement, iron, or electricity. During that process, carbon goes up into the atmosphere. Under this new system, the exact volume of those emissions is carefully tracked. Step 2, the border. That manufactured good gets loaded onto a cargo ship, crosses the ocean, and arrives at the customs border of a nation that actually has a carbon border tax in place. Then, Step 3, tax assessment. This is where the game totally changes. Customs officials don't just check the weight and standard tariffs anymore. Nope, they look at that carbon footprint documented all the way back in Step 1. The border toll is mathematically calculated based on exactly how much carbon was emitted to make that specific good. So high emissions equal a high tax. It is a direct, point-of-entry financial hit based entirely on how a product was made thousands of miles away. Which leads us to Section 4, the new economic divide. Two sides of the global market. Now that we've got the micro-level journey down, let's zoom out of it, because this literally splits the world's economy in two. We're looking at two resulting sides of the global market, just impartially mapped out by pure economics. On one side, you've got nations with carbon pricing. In these countries, domestic producers are already paying a tax or a fee for their carbon emissions internally. And because they've already paid the price at home, when they export their goods to a country with a carbon border tax, they face little to zero additional border toll. Their goods just flow smoothly. On the flip side, you have nations without carbon pricing. Domestic producers there aren't paying any internal fees for their emissions. But, and here's the catch, when they export their goods, they get hit with the full, unadjusted carbon border tax at that toll booth. This creates a stark, undeniable structural division. Two completely different sets of rules, depending simply on the internal climate policies of the exporting nation. Let's look at the fallout in Section 5, redrawing the trade map, the impact on global commerce. You just simply cannot drop a massive new toll booth into the middle of the global economy without trade routes violently shifting to adapt. The world market is literally slicing into two distinct categories. One slice represents the market subject to carbon border taxes. These are exports coming from countries without internal carbon pricing that are suddenly going to become way more expensive when selling to places like the European Union, which, by the way, is a primary driver of all this. The other slice represents markets that are exempt or aligned. This is trade between countries that share similar carbon pricing structures where goods can still move relatively friction-free. So if you're a manufacturer, you suddenly have to ask yourself, which market am I actually built to sell into? Because the global market, it's really no longer a single unified playing field. So what does this actually mean for the system? Let's take these systemic effects one by one, because the macroeconomic gravity here is absolutely massive. First, it alters traditional import and export routes. If a buyer in Europe used to buy cheap, high-emission steel from abroad, well, that steel is no longer cheap after the border tax hits it. So they're going to reroute their entire supply chain to find cleaner producers, completely redrawing international shipping lines. Second, it fundamentally shifts competitive advantages between nations. For decades, a competitive advantage was basically just built on cheap energy, right? Didn't matter how much it emitted. Now, a competitive advantage might actually belong to the nation with the cleanest power grid because their exports will totally avoid the border toll. And third, it creates immediate financial incentives for greener manufacturing globally. This literally moves the conversation out of the environmental department and straight into the accounting department. Upgrading a factory to lower emissions isn't just a PR move anymore, it's quite literally a direct requirement to maintain access to major global markets without going totally bankrupt at the border toll booth. Finally, Section 6, why this matters now, the immediate reality of CBAM. It is incredibly easy to look at global trade policies as something far off in the future, right? Like something for diplomats to just debate in stuffy boardrooms. But that is absolutely not the case here. As our source material points out, CBAM is quietly creating a new global economic divide. The absolutely crucial takeaway here is that word creating. It's present tense. Mechanisms like Europe's CBAM are already in their transitional phases. The reporting has already begun. These toll booths are actively being constructed right now. Supply chain managers, corporate executives, and national governments are aggressively running the math today to figure out exactly how they're going to survive the new trade map tomorrow. Which leaves us with this final, really critical thought to ponder. As this carbon toll booth completely reshapes the very foundations of global trade, altering supply chains and shifting global power dynamics, which side of the divide will your economy fall on? Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this super fascinating structural shift. Keep learning, keep exploring, and I'll catch you in the next deep dive.